Watch it. Okay, so these are proofs. And all a proof is, all you're doing is trying to prove something, right? So right here they said, they give us this information. Y'all see that? So they gave us this information. They tell us that. And they're saying, where is my other color? Right there. And they're saying, Lord help me, to prove that. That's what they want to prove. Prove that. Now, here's something that we know. We know that if we can prove the two triangles are congruent, then we can prove all their parts are congruent also, right? So,
I'm leaving after, yes.
Okay, so they're saying if you're given this information, let's prove this, right? And if we can prove the triangles are congruent, we can prove all their parts are congruent, right? So the very first blank they left us, they told us was a given. Okay, but then they also, we got to look and see what did they get. Well, they didn't give us anything. So they're wanting us to write all the given on that one blank. So we're going to say that segment AB is parallel to segment DC. Okay? Segment AB, this guy up here, is parallel to segment DC. This guy down here. They're parallel to each other. And I'm going to mark that. And you know the marking for showing parallel is you put a little arrow on both lines. And they told us that angle B is congruent to angle D. Now, me personally, I would split that up into two statements. I wouldn't make it one statement. I'd make it two, but they're making it one. So angle B, this guy right here, is congruent to angle D, this guy right here. Okay? Now, on this next line, they gave us the statement that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So let's go ahead and mark that because they're telling us that we know that. Now let's talk about how we know that. Remember what they said about these two lines being parallel? Y'all remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
Those two lines are parallel. Remember when we learned all that stuff about if you have parallel lines and then you have a transversal? Remember that? What would we call this angle and this angle? Almost. Alternate interior, right? Alternate. So the reason that we know that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent is because they are alternate interior angles. Okay? Then they gave us this information. So these proofs that we're working on right now, we're filling in blanks and we're going by what they have written there. And so normally you would come up with these on your own, but we're just using what they have and saying, oh, this is how we know that, right? So they said that segment AC is congruent to segment AC. Why is that? Reflexive property. Reflexive property. Remember that? Remember? That is the one whenever they share it. Okay? Now, at this point, we can tell those triangles are congruent. And they put that there, right? That the two triangles are congruent. How can we tell? What is our reasoning? Which one of those triangle congruence theorems works here? So we have an angle. We have an angle. And then we have a side that's not between the angles. So which one is that? Angle, angle, side. Angle, angle, side congruence. So, since we know that these two triangles are congruent, what do we know about all their parts? They're congruent. So now that we said these two triangles are congruent, we can go ahead and say, oh, that means that BC is congruent to DA. How do we know it? Because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. I'm going to write that out. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. I'm abbreviating because I'm running out of room. All right, so see how you just fill in those blanks, right? All right, so let's try number 2. Okay, so we've got this diagram right here. They gave us this information. They want us to prove this information. So our very last statement is going to be that KB is congruent to AB. Okay, that's the very last thing. So we're looking for, how can we figure out that KB is congruent to AB, right? Well, we need to prove what about those two triangles? We need to prove they're what? Congruent. So we need to use one of those congruent statements. So let's go to what information they gave us. They said that QK is congruent to QA. So let's mark that. QK is congruent to QA, right? QK is congruent to QA, and that's given. Notice how the only reason that they gave us given is on the first thing. That means we've got to list both of those pieces of information up there. So the other piece that they gave us was that QB bisects angle KQA. So QB, this segment right here, bisects angle KQA. What does bisects mean? Goes through, but very specifically how? In half, right? So bisects means it cuts in half. Anytime you see the word bisect, know that that means it cuts in half. Okay? Bisects means cuts in half. Every single time that you see bisects, that's what that means. Yes, sir. Okay? Carly, can you see a little better now? Okay, so if this segment right here cuts this big angle in half, what do we know about that angle and that angle? They're the same. So we just discovered that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Right? Now, if you look at that, see how it says definition of an angle bisector here? That's because we just learned that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 because we talked about it being it bisecting. Now, I'm going to be honest. I don't like filling in other people's proofs because sometimes I do things in a different order, right? So I'm not looking for perfection on these. I'm looking for we can figure out what they're saying, okay? Look at our reason number 3 here. Reflexive property. What are they talking about? The line that they share, right? So what do we know about this line right here? QB is congruent to QB, right? Because it's in both of them. So we're going to write that. QB is congruent to QB. Why? Because of the reflexive property. So we know that they're congruent. Now, we've got down to this triangle is congruent to this triangle, right? We've got to fill in this blank about which triangle it is. We'll come back to that in a second. But how do we know that they're congruent to each other? Which triangle congruence theorem are we using? What do we know? And sometimes it's helpful if you only look at one of the triangles and your markings on it. So if you just look at one, we know a side, We know an angle. We know a side. What's it going to be? Side, angle, side. So our triangle congruence theorem is side, angle, side. Now, let's go back over here because we got to fill this in too. Remember, when you name congruent triangles, you have to put their angle measures in order of the ones that are congruent. So which angle in this triangle is congruent to angle K? A. So we put it first. Which one's congruent to angle B? B. Which one's congruent to angle Q? Q. Okay, so now that we know the two triangles are congruent, what do we know about all of their parts? They're all congruent. So that means we can go, oh, that means KB is congruent to AB, right? So we just proved what we were trying to prove. Does that make sense? And what's our reason over here? CPCTC. That blank was too small for me to write in. I had to make it a little bigger. How do y'all feel about these? It's not that bad, right? It's just your thoughts on paper. It's how you think things out on paper. Okay, so let's look at number 3 together. So number 3's got some symbols we haven't talked about in a minute. That may have been a little excessive. Okay, what does that symbol mean right there? What does this mean? That means perpendicular. And what does perpendicular mean? Intersecting at a very specific way, though. 90-degree angle. So perpendicular means it intersects it at a 90-degree angle, right? So it's when you have lines that intersect and it makes a 90-degree angle. Okay, so the very first one, what are we going to have up here, y'all? Given. We're going to have all of our given. And like I said, I personally prefer to put my given on separate steps. They're putting it all as one step. To me, that's confusing, but you can do it however you want to, okay? So on their given, they've got that BD is perpendicular to AB. Now, what does that tell us about BD, and AB? What does that tell us? If they're perpendicular, there's a 90-degree angle there. We're going to get to that in a minute, but let's go ahead and mark it, and then we'll come back to it in a minute, okay? They also told us that BD is perpendicular to DE. So we got the same thing going on right here, right? And then they said that segment AB is congruent to segment DE. Segment AB, this guy, is congruent to segment DE, this guy. And that was all given to us. So, we just talked about how angle B and angle D are right angles. How did we know that? How did we know that they were right angles? Definition of a perpendicular. Because they told us that those lines were perpendicular. So that means we know that the angles created are 90 degrees. Okay, so this next one's a little bit tricky. Notice we've got a blank over here. And then over here it says all blank angles are congruent. What angles were we just talking about? Right angles, right? All right angles are congruent. That's going to be our reasoning. All right angles are congruent. Now, which angles are we talking about? Because that's what we got to put over here. Which two angles are we talking about being congruent? So we're going to say angle B is congruent to angle D. Look at you go.
I think sometimes my brain's like there when you talk about it. You know what I mean?
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I have the same thing. I think we all have it, Tara Lee. We all have that where sometimes our brain kicks in, sometimes it don't.
and then FE's.
Mm-hmm. That's why I tell you guys you can't say something's easy. Because something may be super easy for one person that another person really struggles with. And then you may turn around in 2 days and the person who was struggling may be having an easy time and the other person is really struggling. Okay, look at this next statement they said. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Let's go look at our diagram. How? Vertical angles. So, we can put vertical angles, we can put definition of vertical angles. You're going to see both in different settings, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and put definition of vertical angles. Okay, so now we're at the step where they're saying that the triangles are congruent. How do we know the triangles are congruent? Which congruence theorem are we using here? Remember, sometimes it helps to cover up one of the triangles. We know an angle, right? We know an angle.
Angle, side, angle.
Side angle.
So is it angle, angle, side, or is it angle, side, angle?
Angle, angle, side.
It's angle, angle, side. Why? Because that side is not between the two angles. Okay? So angle, angle, side. Now, it's not HL. Let's talk about why it's not HL. HL, you got to know the hypotenuse. And we don't know that the hypotenuses are congruent. Okay? So triangle ABC is congruent to what triangle? E, D, C. Good job. So now that we know the two triangles are congruent, what do we know about all their parts? They're all congruent. So we can say angle A is congruent to angle E. How? Perfect. Y'all look at that. I did dishes and I took a shower and I still have paint on my hand. How does that even happen? It's just acrylic paint. It's not even anything special. That should have washed off. I would be concerned about the fact that I took a shower, but I also washed dishes and it still didn't wash off. So, huh? No, I did. It won't even scrub off with my fingernail. Oh, maybe I'm getting it now. That's kind of hurting, though. Okay. Let's do this one together. What we got? Given. FJ is congruent to GH. FJ is congruent to GH. So FJ is congruent to GH. Okay? And then angle JFH is congruent to angle GHF. Angle JFH, that's this angle, is congruent to GHF, that's this angle. Okay, what else do we know? Well, first of all, what's our reason right there? Given. Okay, now what else do we know just based on that diagram? I know you can see your paper, but let's just think it through. What do we know here? FH is congruent to FH. Why? Because they're the same. Now, what's our property that we use? Reflexive. Reflexive property. If H is congruent to H. Now, see how they wrote it backwards? You're going to see that sometimes too. It doesn't make any difference. You can do it either way. Okay? Just so that you know. You can do it both ways. So they're already telling us we know these triangles are congruent. How do we know they're congruent? What's our reasoning? We know a side. We know an angle. And we know a side. So what's it going to be? Side, angle, side. Now we got to list the two triangles.
JFH is congruent to HGF.
JFH is congruent to
No. GHF. What? That's right.
JFH is congruent to, what's congruent to J? G. What's congruent to F? H. What's congruent to H? F. Woo! That one was hard. Okay, so what do we know about all their parts? They're congruent. So that means that we can say FG is congruent to JH. How do we know? CPCTC. All right, one more we're going to do together, and then we'll let you work on your own, okay? I tell you what, let's try. Let's see if y'all can do this. Try it. Try it. Take a couple minutes and try this one, then we'll go over it, okay? Take a few minutes and try this one on your own. Let's see what you got. Give it your best shot. I forgot to put my cell phone on. Anybody else with an iPhone having issues with when it updated, it changed every setting on your phone?
Yes.
Yeah,
No?
It was great.
that was amazing.
Yeah, I did.
Like it even changed the sounds my alarms make. Oh my gosh. I'm so frustrated. I'm having to constantly, like I used to have my phone set to where it automatically went to do not disturb at 7:45 and stayed on till 3. And now it doesn't do it anymore. I didn't change it.
Well, I had to turn my reader off and check because I already told you guys.
It's a good thing I didn't just Okay, so let's go ahead and talk it over real quick, okay? So they told us that CN is perpendicular to AB. So CN being perpendicular to AB, what does that create? Right angle here and a right angle there, right? And that's going to be on our next step. Angle 3 and angle 4 are right angles. How do we know it? How do we know that they're right angles? Well, yes. So we know that it's perpendicular because it was given, but then the conclusion from them being perpendicular to 3 and 4 are right angles you have to state. Okay? So what does that tell us about those two angles if we know they're both right angles? If they're both right angles, what do we know about them? They're congruent. So then we say angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. How do we know? All right angles are congruent / 90 degrees. Both of those things are accurate, right? Okay. What else did they give us? They said that CN bisects ACB. So CN bisects ACB. What did that tell us about these two angles? They're congruent. So this angle is congruent to this angle. So we're going to say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. How? Definition of a angle bisector. Okay. What else do we know? CN is congruent to CN. How do we know that? Reflexive property. So, guess what we just proved? I just did that. Triangle ANC is congruent to triangle BNC. How? What was our congruence theorem? Angle side angle. So what do we know about all their parts? And what's our reason? Perfect. Good job, you guys. So you have 6 to do on your own. Now, if your steps don't match up with their steps exactly, like this one has 6 steps, if you have 5 or you have 7 or whatever, that's fine, okay? Sometimes we think things through differently, all right? Okay, so y'all get busy.